How many of you here have a GPS in your car or one of those portable ones that just pop in? Okay. Of those of you that have a GPS, how many of you really listen to it, pay attention to it, follow it? I'm impressed. I'm impressed. In December, I had to travel from where I live in England to Benedictine Abbey at Downside. And so I was traveling with a fellow Dominican. First of all, for me to get in traffic in England is an act of faith. I'm riding in their passenger seat and there's no steering wheel on my side. That's the problem there. But this fellow that I was traveling with, I'm convinced that he thought if he stopped talking for a moment, the motor on the car would die. So the entire trip, this guy was bombarding me with everything going on, all this stuff. And he'd never been to Downside. I certainly had never been to Downside. And so he had borrowed a GPS system with a lovely Irish woman's accent on there. We're driving along and I notice that really, whatever she says doesn't matter to this guy. Simply because he doesn't really hear it at all. So we're getting to a critical point, and you can see on the little electronic map that's there, and I hear this lovely little voice, "At the next roundabout, take the second left." I hear that. He's talking non-stop. We get to the second roundabout, just about to enter it. Again, the lovely voice says, "At the roundabout, take the second left." We go past the first exit. We go past the second exit. She says, "Take the second left." He proceeds to take the third left, saying, "Oh, these things don't know what they're doing. This is where we're supposed to go." A few moments later, I hear the lovely Irish voice say, "At the first safe location, turn around." I'm convinced in my mind I also heard her say, "You fool." One of the realities in our life is the journey that we embark upon. And in the gospel that we have, this individual, this scholar of the law, a person wanting to live a devout life by following the law of Israel, simply asked Jesus a question. And so we've heard this story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, a number of times, but it's important for us to take a look at what Jesus is doing for this person. Because the person wants to understand how to live his faith, how to live what the law calls him to do and to be. So notice Jesus says to him, "How do you understand the law?" And he gives really, I think, one of the most beautiful answers. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your being, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, "You've answered well." But notice what he does. He wants to justify himself. Not enter into the wonderful answer he's given and learn from that, but to somehow justify himself. Why? For fudging on the reality that he knows is true. So Jesus proceeds to tell him a story. And the story is of this journeyer who is beset upon by thieves. Now, the thing for us to realize is we tend to think, how could those first two, the priest and the Levi, be so heartless as to walk right by a person in need? Until we realize that in Jewish law, in the Deuteronomic law, to come upon a person who is dead was a defilement. So in one sense, there was an act of faith on the part of these two individuals. Their sense of fidelity to the law. But Jesus says, and a third person came along. A Samaritan, clearly a person who wasn't living the law of Israel, wasn't even Jewish. And what happens? He cares for this person. And again, notice what Jesus does to this individual. He says to the person, "Who do you think was neighbor to this individual?" And of course, he gives the answer. The one who showed him compassion and mercy. Sometimes in our lives, we know what we're called to do, but we tend to look the other way. We tend to find it easier just to keep right on going. We don't stop and take the time to really listen and to know what God has written in our hearts and to allow that to guide us. God really does have a GPS. It's the gospel that's been given to us. It's a way in which it helps us shape and guide our life and journey through life's difficulties. No matter how many roundabouts there are always moments where God's words come to us and guide us. Even when we make a mistake, God's voice speaks lovingly to us. Turn around. Turn around. Change your heart. Don't think that the evil you've done, no matter how great it seems to you, is any obstacle or barrier to coming home. Turn around and discover what God means in terms of our lives. And so in this story of the Good Samaritan, we recognize that it is a call for us to appreciate that God has given to us a guide that far surpasses the letter of the law. And in the first reading from the book of Deuteronomy, which is really the compendium, the kind of gathering of what the Jewish law is all about, notice that it is the gift of the law that ought to do what? To be so close to us that it's in our hearts and in our actions. Laws are not about external observance. Laws are guides that help us become who God has called us to be. St. Paul, in prison, writing to the church in Galatia, was it Galatia? Was that the... Who did that reading? Writing in that church, is aware of how people can confuse what their faith means. And far surpassing the letter of the law, Paul makes us aware that the reality that guides us most deeply is what? Our relationship with Christ. Our coming to know that Christ is the first of all, that Christ in all of creation is manifest and present, that Christ is the sovereign, is the one who calls us to a sense of knowing more fully everything about ourselves. And that reality of who Christ is written on our hearts, is present to us in our midst. It is a challenge then for us to take the time and to ask ourselves, where are we journeying? What guides us? And if at the end of the day it's things rather than Christ, we've taken the wrong turn. If at the end of the day our hearts don't swell with the bounty of love, we've made a mistake. If at the end of the day we still harbor those hurts and pettinesses from years ago, we need to really turn around, you fool, and come home. The power of this story of Jesus telling us that it is the unlikely one who recognizes in mercy and compassion the presence of God is the thing that you and I ought to grab hold of. Our world can be so cruel and heartless, but it's the power of compassion. It's the power of mercy. It's the power of love that allows us to change the harsh and hardness of our world and call us to something new. It is a gift for us as a people of faith to come home, to recognize that in Jesus Christ there is something of a wonder that unfolds for us, and allowing that to take shape in us. The gift of the law guides us, but it's meant to be something that's brought within. Don't skim along life on the surface. Go down deeply into the mystery of who you are and the mystery of what your life means, and discover something great that God has planted there. Meister Eckhart, one of the great mystics from the Middle Ages, uses the analogy that's used by a number of spiritual writers. But when he talks about our living the faith and our entering into the Scriptures, he says some of us just stand on the shoreline, just kind of dabbing our foot into the water. Some of us venture out maybe to where the water is knee-deep or waist-high, and we fear to go forward. But some people, and he says, like an elephant, go out into the middle of the stream where they're able to touch the bottom of what the gospel is about and have that sense of security. Don't live in the shallows of life. Take the risk. The GPS that you have isn't the voice of an Irish woman talking to you in your car. The GPS that you have is your baptism. It's made you one with Christ. And the nearness of that reality of Christ is so important and powerful for us not to lose sight of. Never let anyone take that from you. Never settle for the things that are superficial when you know that in the very heart of your being there, God speaks to you and guides you in the midst of difficulties and challenges. At those moments of unknown future, at those moments when there are decisions of moral magnitude, at those moments when we would really rather give up and know that something calls us to be more than we thought we could possibly be. Know that in those moments, God is in you. The power, the mystery of what Jesus shows us is that in the reality of Christ, the firstborn of all creation, dominions and sovereignty lay low. For in our lives, God is present in your life, in your heart. Find Him.